When people think of Riesling, so often they're focused on it just being a big fruity or sweet wine, when in fact you can do so many different things with it, and around here we do. We have a series we call Fût de Chêne, and Fût de Chêne is basically just French for aged in oak or raised in oak. And our Fût de Chêne series focuses on producing a style of Riesling that is very different from what you may had at other wineries or picked up at a liquor store. Because what we're focused on isn't so much fruit as texture. And when I say texture, what I'm talking about is the way it falls onto your palate, the richness that you feel, the way the interplay between acid and alcohol and fruit takes place. Rather than it being one thing, we try and think of this series as offering the consumer many different styles, flavor profiles of Riesling. I also like to say that it's a style of Riesling for the Chardonnay lover, because like Chardonnay, which often has a little bit restrained fruit flavor profiles, our Fût de Chêne series tends to not be the big fruit bomb that, for example, our 2018 Riesling is. So let's take a look at this wine in particular. Our 2016 Fût de Chêne is a blend of two different vineyard sites, all of which were fermented and raised in neutral or old oak barrels. We chose old oak barrels because we aren't looking to accentuate any oak flavors in this wine. The thing we're really looking for is to build weight and density on the palate, which happens largely through the aging process. So as the yeast are consuming the sugars and fermenting the wine, they reach a point where eventually the yeast culture dies. In this case, it was largely because there was really no sugar left in the wine for them to consume. And when that happens, over time, they fall out of suspension, they fall to the bottom of the barrel, and their cells begin to degrade. When that happens, everything inside of that cell is essentially released into the wine. In winemaking, we call that process autolysis. And what it does is it basically increases the amino acids in the wine and changes the profile a bit. It adds some density. It offers some additional flavor notes like brioche or almond. Autolysis doesn't happen right away. It's really dependent upon temperature and time. The warmer the temperature, the less time. The lower the temperature, the more time. We like to keep our barrel room right around 58 degrees, which meant that we had to keep the wine in barrel for at least 8 months to really start to get some of the benefits of autolysis in this wine. So it did stay in barrel right around 10, 11 months, and we got it in bottle really as harvest in 2017 was beginning. And then we allowed it to age in the winery for a while, in bottle. And what that did was help to integrate a lot of the flavors of this wine. So 2016 was a really hot and dry vintage. And it was so hot and so dry that it actually, in some sites, especially shallow sites, where there wasn't much access to water or where vine age wasn't really old and the roots weren't deep enough to pull up a lot of water, it led to vines beginning to stop the ripening process. They had to preserve their carbohydrates to overwinter. And so the sugar levels didn't get exorbitant. This wine clocks in at 11.5% alcohol. Most of the fruit was harvested right around 20 bricks. This comes from the Gibson Vineyard and from the Cochon Glen Vineyard. Both of these are north of the winery, and Gibson Vineyard's about 10 minutes north, Cochon Glen's maybe 15 minutes north. They're grown on very different soil types. Gibson is on a kind of a deposit, a glacial deposit, where the soils are really deep and really rich. It's right next to the lake. It tends to produce a very fruit-forward style of Riesling. And Cochon Glen, further north, sits on a ridge with very little soil. It tends to produce much more linear and electric styles of Riesling. Together, aged separately in barrel, we actually used a selection of 6 different yeasts. So of the 12 barrels that went into this wine, a number of them were uninoculated, so no yeast was added. And then a smattering of different yeast cultures, including BA11, RHST, CY3079, and then a number of others actually, but Those were all used to bring out different flavor notes, different profiles. So let's go ahead and taste this wine. So this is a wine with some age already in bottle now. This was bottled in 17, so we're looking at just around 3 years. It still has a very bright, young, light straw color to it that doesn't lead me to think that it's very old. This wine, in my opinion, is probably going to hang on for quite a while, as Riesling does, in part due to its lower alcohol and its higher acid. So right off the top of the bat, I'm getting just a subtle hint at the idea of the petrol notes that we find in Riesling as it ages. My wife doesn't like that too much. I personally love it. This wine is so low on the threshold, though, that it wouldn't be considered offensive to the person who doesn't like that petrol note, which, by the way, we call TDN. With that, right behind there, you start to pick up some of the citrus and some of the apples, almost kind of like a baked apple pie. And just peeking back behind the apple, I was getting some nice Bartlett pear. At this point in time, I'm sure you've all seen that movie Psalm. And if you haven't, it's definitely worth a watch. The petrol note I'm talking about really matches that tennis ball container that they talk about in that movie. So you get a new can of tennis balls, you pop the top, you smell that, and it's this almost like slightly plastic, whatever it is, it's there, it's very typical, and I personally like it. I like it a lot when I'm eating a pork dish. Immediately, the thing that strikes me on the palate is just how broad this wine is. We're talking about a Riesling that has relatively low alcohol, but the combination of the fruit, the vintage, and that kind of autolytic factor of having a chance to spend time with the spent yeast has really broadened it out. I wouldn't usually expect a Riesling that's only 11.5 to have this much sort of palate density, but time is doing this wine great favors. But right behind the palate density, the thing that strikes me is we've got this sort of lemon zest. We've got this kind of bright, fresh, apple crisp flavor to it. This wine, I've tasted this now for several years, is really just starting to come into its own. There's nothing about it that's tasting tired or kind of old or spent. I'm finding that we are, this many years in, just starting to see that this wine is reaching this capacity of knowing who it is. I think the acid will still dial back a little bit more in time. I would say this wine will be at peak drinking probably in about 3 to 5 more years if it's stored correctly. But overall, I'm thrilled to be revisiting this with you today. I think you're really going to like it. On a wine with this level of bright, crisp, fresh acid, being a Riesling, I would definitely be looking towards some creamier dishes. I would like this with maybe like a fettuccine with shrimp, with an Alfredo sauce. Anytime you want to pair it with mussels and some great big piece of sourdough bread with butter slathered on it, you are going to thank yourself. Because it lends itself, that combination of fruit and acidity, I get this salinity on the palate. So I would be thinking of any kind of fish dishes. To be honest, just picking up a fish fry on a Friday night with this is going to be a great pairing. But you could certainly get a lot fancier. And this wine will hold up to that standard of whatever it is you're looking to pair up with it. But stick with the white meats, stick with the seafood. Creamy cheeses will go great with this. And overall, not my favorite as a sipping wine, I tend to prefer a little bit more residual sugar when I'm doing that. But a food wine that I will take almost any day of the week.